Between 1941 and 1945, the Nazi regime murdered approximately 6 million Jewish people, along with an additional 5 million or more non-Jewish victims. But that number, staggering as it is, can obscure something important. These deaths did not happen in chaos. They happened in order. There were schedules, there were budgets, there were engineers who drew blueprints, officials who signed requisitions, and railway administrators who coordinated timetables. There were men who clocked in, did their work, and went home for dinner. This is the part that history struggles to process. Not that monsters existed, but that the machinery of mass murder was built, maintained, and expanded by ordinary institutional processes. By memos, by promotions, by quarterly reports. The Nazi extermination program, what the regime itself called the final solution to the Jewish question, was a bureaucratic project of unprecedented scale. It required the coordination of the SS, the Reich railways, the German civil service, and the military-industrial complex. It required complicity across dozens of occupied nations, and it required physical infrastructure. 6 facilities, constructed in occupied Poland between 1941 and 1942, were designated as pure killing centers. Not labor camps, not transit camps, extermination camps. Their single operational purpose was death. Tonight, we examine the 5 deadliest. We will move from the smallest to the largest, from Sobibor to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Because scale itself is part of the story, because understanding how the system grew, how it refined its methods, how it increased its capacity, quarter by quarter, is the only way to understand how something this vast became possible. Who designed these places? How did they function? How did the people running them understand what they were doing? And what does it mean that this machinery operated largely without disruption for years? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. Because the lesson of these 5 camps is not simply that evil exists. The lesson is that evil can be organized, that it can be staffed and funded and expanded, that it can be made, in the minds of those doing it, to seem routine. This is the story of 5 places built for one purpose, and of the millions of human lives reduced, in the language of their killers, to a logistical problem to be solved. The solution was murder, and it was engineered. March 1942. In a dense forest in eastern Poland, near the village of Sobibor, construction workers completed a facility that the SS had quietly commissioned 2 months earlier. It was modest in size, roughly 600 by 400 meters. It had a reception area, a processing yard, and at the far end of a camouflaged pathway, 3 gas chambers. It had a staff of fewer than 30 SS men and several hundred Ukrainian auxiliaries. It was also, within weeks of opening, killing thousands of people per day. Sobibor was one of 3 camps established under Operation Reinhard. The SS program specifically designed to murder the Jews of occupied Poland. The other 2 were Belzec and Treblinka. All 3 were constructed in remote locations, near railway lines, screened by trees. All 3 were designed to receive, process, and kill large numbers of people as quickly and quietly as possible. What distinguished Sobibor from the other Reinhard camps was its relative obscurity, then and now. It lacked the infamous reputation of Treblinka, or the industrial scale of Auschwitz. It was, in the language of its builders, a functional facility. It worked, it was maintained, and for most of its operational life, it was almost entirely unknown to the outside world. The camp was commanded initially by SS Obersturmführer Franz Stangl, who would later transfer to Treblinka. Stangl was not a fantasist or an ideologue in the obvious sense. He was a career police administrator from Austria, organized, efficient, focused on operational performance. When interviewed decades later by journalist Gitta Sereni, he described his initial posting to Sobibor with bureaucratic detachment. His concern, he said, was whether the facilities worked properly. They did. The operational structure of Sobibor was straightforward and deliberate. Deportees arrived by train, primarily from the Lublin district, from the Netherlands, from France, and from Slovakia. They were told they had arrived at a transit camp and would receive food, showers, and processing before relocation further east. This narrative was maintained with care. Camp personnel were instructed to keep order, to avoid panic, to move people efficiently. The path from the train platform to the gas chambers was approximately 150 meters long. It was called, with characteristic SS black humor, the Tube, a narrow fenced corridor screened on both sides so that those walking it could not see what lay ahead. At the far end were the chambers, disguised as shower facilities. The gas used was carbon monoxide, pumped in from a diesel engine. Death typically occurred within 20 to 30 minutes. The bodies were initially buried in mass graves on the campgrounds. Later, following an order from SS Obergruppenführer Odilo Globoknik, the bodies were exhumed and burned, part of a broader effort, codenamed Action 1005, to destroy the evidence of what had been done. Between April 1942 and October 1943, an estimated 170,000 to 250,000 people were murdered at Sobibor. The precise figure remains uncertain because the Nazis destroyed most records before the camp was dismantled. Itself a revealing fact about the perpetrators' understanding of what they had built. On October 14, 1943, the prisoners of Sobibor staged the most successful mass escape from any Nazi extermination camp. Led by Soviet Jewish POW Alexander Pechersky and Dutch Jewish prisoner Leon Feldhendler, approximately 300 prisoners broke out following the coordinated killing of 11 SS officers. Around 50 ultimately survived the war. The SS response was immediate. Within weeks, Sobibor was demolished. The buildings were torn down, the grounds were plowed, and trees were planted over the site. A farm was established on the land. The intent was erasure, to make the place disappear from the physical and historical record as completely as possible. For decades, it nearly worked. Sobibor remained the least excavated, least documented of the Operation Reinhard camps. Archaeological investigations beginning in the 2000s and intensifying in the 2010s began to recover what the demolition had failed to destroy. The outlines of gas chamber foundations, thousands of personal objects, fragments of the lives of those who arrived and never left. What Sobibor represents in the larger architecture of the final solution is the prototype model. It proved that the system worked, that people could be transported, processed, and killed at scale without significant disruption, and that the operation could be maintained in near total secrecy. The lessons learned at Sobibor would be applied elsewhere, at facilities larger, faster, and deadlier. The next one was already being built. There is a statistic about Belzec that deserves a moment of stillness before the analysis begins. Of the estimated 430,000 to 500,000 people murdered at Belzec between March 1942 and December 1942, a period of less than 10 months, only 2 Jews are known to have survived the war. 2 from 500,000. No extermination facility in history achieved a higher kill ratio relative to its survivor count. Belzec was the first of the 3 Operation Reinhard camps to become operational, opening in March 1942 under the command of SS Hauptsturmführer Christian Wörth, a man whose colleagues described as brutal even by the standards of the SS. Wörth had previously administered the T4 euthanasia program, in which the Nazi regime murdered approximately 70,000 Germans with physical and mental disabilities. That program gave him direct experience in the logistics of mass gassing and body disposal. He brought that expertise to Belzec and later carried it to the other Reinhard camps as their overall inspector. Belzec was modest in physical size but relentless in operational tempo. The camp's initial gas chamber facility, 3 chambers, was expanded in June 1942 to 6 larger chambers capable of processing several thousand people simultaneously. The facility was powered, like Sobibor, by a diesel engine producing carbon monoxide. The railway connection was direct. Deportees arrived from the Galicia district of occupied Poland, from Lwów, Krakow, and the surrounding areas, as well as from other parts of the general government. Trains typically carried between 40 and 60 freight cars, each packed far beyond capacity. Witnesses who worked in the loading areas described scenes of dehydration, suffocation, and death even before the trains arrived. Rudolf Rieder, one of the 2 known Jewish survivors of Belzec, provided testimony after the war that gives a precise and terrible account of the camp's operation. He described the arrival process, the orders given, the confusion maintained deliberately, the speed at which people were moved from the train platform to the gas chambers. He described the work of the Sonderkommando, the Jewish prisoner labor detail forced to remove bodies from the gas chambers and carry them to mass graves. He described Wirth walking through the camp, conducting inspections. What Rader's testimony reveals above all is the relentless pace. Belzec was designed for throughput. There was no pretense of labor selection here, no division of arrivals into those who would work and those who would die immediately. Everyone who arrived at Belzec was scheduled to die. Children, elderly people, the sick, those who had walked into the cars hoping for resettlement, all of them were processed through the same system. The speed was itself a form of terror management. The faster the operation moved, the less time people had to understand what was happening. By late 1942, the mass graves at Belzec were creating practical problems. The decomposition of hundreds of thousands of bodies was causing the ground to shift visibly and producing gases that locals in the surrounding area could smell from a distance. This was not a moral crisis for the SS administration. It was a logistical one. The decision was made to exhume and incinerate the remains. Belzec was closed in December 1942, not because it had failed, but because it had largely completed its assigned task. The Jewish population of the Galicia district had been, in the language of the perpetrators, processed. The camp was demolished in the spring of 1943, the site planted over with vegetation. The 2 survivors, Raeder and Chaim Hirschman, who was murdered by Polish anti-Semites in 1946 before he could complete his full testimony, are the only first-hand Jewish witnesses to the interior of Belzec's operations. Their accounts and the post-war testimony of a small number of German and Ukrainian personnel constitute almost the entirety of the direct documentary record. This near-total absence of survivor testimony is itself a historical fact of enormous significance. The Nazis very nearly succeeded at Belzec in the secondary goal that accompanied every extermination operation, the erasure of the evidence, and with it, the possibility of witness. Belzec proved that industrialized mass murder, conducted rapidly and in near-total secrecy, was operationally feasible. What it had not yet achieved was permanent scale. The facility that would address that limitation was already in operation 30 miles to the northeast, and it had learned from everything that came before Belzec, before Sobibor, before the gas chambers of the Operation Reinhard camps were built or staffed or operational. There was Chelmno. Chelmno was the first facility in which the Nazi regime systematically murdered human beings with poison gas. It opened on December 8, 1941, 14 days before the Wannsee Conference at which senior Nazi officials coordinated the administrative framework of the final solution. Chelmno did not wait for the conference. It was already running. The method used at Chelmno was distinctive. Unlike the Reinhard camps, which used fixed gas chambers, Chelmno employed mobile gas vans, enclosed trucks into which exhaust fumes were pumped while the vehicles were in motion. This approach had been developed and tested during the earlier T4 program in the Soviet Union. It was considered, by its developers, an improvement over shooting, which was deemed psychologically damaging to the perpetrators. The facility was established in and around a manor house in the village of Chelmno nad Nerem in the Warthegau region of occupied Poland, an area that had been incorporated directly into the German Reich. The Jews of this region, including the approximately 200,000 inhabitants of the Łódź ghetto, were Chelmno's primary victims. The command structure was simple. A unit of SS men, the Sonderkommando Kulmhof, roughly 150 personnel at its peak, operated the facility under a series of commanders, most notably SS Hauptsturmführer Herbert Lange and later Hans Bothmann. These were not ideological zealots drawn from SS elite units. Many were middle-aged police reservists and auxiliary personnel who had been transferred to the unit from other duties. The operational process at Chelmno followed a deliberate script. Deportees arrived by rail or truck, were brought to the manor house grounds, and were told they would receive showers and delousing before being transported to labor assignments further east. They were instructed to undress and hand over their valuables. They were then directed down a passageway, in some accounts described as a ramp, and into the rear of one of the 3 gas vans. The van then departed. By the time it arrived at the Zushuv forest, several kilometers away, the passengers were dead. Jewish prisoner laborers, themselves under sentence of death, unloaded the bodies and buried them in mass graves. These laborers were periodically killed and replaced. Between December 1941 and March 1943, and again during a brief second operational period in 1944, an estimated 150,000 to 180,000 people were murdered at Chelmno. The wide range in estimates reflects the near total destruction of records. The Nazis burned the manor house, scattered the evidence, and killed almost all of the prisoner laborers before Soviet forces approached. Only a handful of Jewish prisoners managed to escape and survive. What makes Chelmno historically significant beyond its death toll is its position in the sequence. It was the proof of concept. It demonstrated that a small administrative unit could murder tens of thousands of people in a rural location with minimal infrastructure over an extended period without significant operational disruption or public exposure. The lessons applied at the Reinhard camps, the deception of arrivals, the management of prisoner labor, the phased destruction of evidence, were refined versions of what had been established at Chelmno. There is also something in Chelmno's founding date worth pausing on. December 8, 1941. One day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war. As the world's attention pivoted to the Pacific, and as the scale of global conflict expanded to encompass multiple theaters simultaneously, the Nazi killing program accelerated. The correlation was not coincidental. Senior Nazi leadership understood that a widening war created cover. Chelmno continued operating in its second phase until January 1945, when the advancing Red Army made continued operations impossible. The final group of prisoner laborers who had been kept alive to manage the last stages of evidence destruction were shot. Almost no one walked out of Chelmno alive. For a facility that preceded all others, that established the method and the logic of the operation, Chelmno remains one of the least examined sites in the public historical record. Its relative obscurity, even within Holocaust education, is itself a quiet continuation of the erasure its operators intended. But what was built at Chelmno, and at Belzec, and at Sobibor, was prologue. The system was still being optimized. In the summer of 1942, a killing facility unlike anything previously built in human history was operating at the edge of a forest in northeastern Poland, near the Bug River. It was not the largest camp. It was not the most heavily staffed, but for a period of approximately 14 months, Treblinka was the most efficient killing facility in the entire Nazi extermination program. Treblinka II, the extermination camp, distinguished from the nearby Treblinka I labor camp, opened on July 23, 1942. On that same date, the mass deportation of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto began. The timing was coordinated. The trains from Warsaw, carrying thousands of people per day from the largest Jewish community in occupied Europe, ran directly to Treblinka. By the end of 1942, an estimated 700,000 people had been murdered there. By the time the camp ceased operations in October 1943, the death toll stood at approximately 700,000 to 900,000. Making Treblinka, per the most accepted historical estimates, the second deadliest site of the Holocaust after Auschwitz-Birkenau. The commandant for most of Treblinka's operational life was SS Obersturmführer Franz Stangl, the same man who had previously commanded Sobibor. Stangl was by this point an experienced manager of mass murder. He applied that experience systematically. Under his command, Treblinka's processing speed increased, its physical layout was expanded, and its gas chamber capacity was multiplied. The original 3 gas chambers at Treblinka were replaced in the fall of 1942 with a new building containing 10 chambers, each capable of holding 200 to 300 people simultaneously. The building was designed to resemble a bathhouse, complete with a Star of David above the entrance and a sign reading "Shower and Steam Bath." The engineering was deliberate. The deception was a functional component of the killing system. The processing sequence at Treblinka was refined to move people from the train platform to the gas chambers in the shortest possible time. Arrivals were divided by gender. Men were taken first, women and children followed. All were told to undress, surrender valuables, and move toward the bathhouse. A path, again called the tube, ran from the undressing area to the gas chamber building. It was lined with high fences interwoven with pine branches and to block visibility. The entire sequence, from arrival to death, was designed to take no more than 2 hours. Richard Glaser, a Czech Jewish survivor of Treblinka, described in his post-war memoir what it meant to understand, over time, the full scale of what was happening. He arrived at the camp as a prisoner laborer, one of a small number kept alive to sort clothing, maintain the facilities, and eventually assist in the exhumation and burning of bodies. He wrote of the disorientation of performing normal physical labor in proximity to industrial mass murder, of the way routine could exist side by side with atrocity. The Treblinka prisoner revolt of August 2, 1943, one of the largest acts of armed resistance within a Nazi exterminations facility, was planned by an underground organization that had spent months acquiring weapons, kerosene, and a key to the camp's arms cache. The uprising involved several hundred prisoners. Buildings were set on fire. Approximately 200 prisoners escaped the perimeter. Fewer than 70 survived the war. SS forces quelled the revolt within hours, but the damage to the physical infrastructure, combined with the fact that Treblinka had by this point largely completed its operational mission, the Warsaw Ghetto and most of the Jewish communities of the General Gouvernement had been destroyed, led to the decision to close the camp. The familiar destruction sequence followed. Buildings were demolished, graves were exhumed and burned, and a farmhouse was constructed on the site. A Ukrainian guard named Strebel was installed as the farmer, his presence intended to suggest that the land had always been agricultural, had never been anything else. Post-war investigations, including extensive archaeological surveys conducted in the 2010s under British archaeologist Carolyn Sturdy-Coles, confirmed the physical dimensions of the extermination area, the location of the gas chamber building, and the presence of mass grave sites. The evidence that the SS had tried to bury outlasted the burial. Franz Stangl was captured in Brazil in 1967, extradited to West Germany, and convicted of joint responsibility for the murder of 900,000 people. He died in prison in 1971, hours after completing an extended interview with journalist Gitta Sereni. In that interview, he said something that has stayed with historians and readers ever since. Not because it was shocking, but because it was so ordinary. He said that he had learned not to see it. That capacity, the learned incapacity to see, was not unique to Stangl. It was a structural feature of the system, and the system was about to reach its largest expression. Auschwitz was not built as an extermination camp. That is perhaps the most important and most frequently misunderstood fact about the most lethal site in the history of organized murder. Auschwitz I, the original facility, was established in May 1940 as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners. It was housed in converted Polish army barracks on the outskirts of the town of Oświęcim in southern occupied Poland. Its first commandant was SS Obersturmbannführer Rudolf Höss, a career concentration camp administrator who had previously served at Dachau in Sachsenhausen. Auschwitz grew. It expanded. It became, over 4 years, a sprawling complex, the single largest installation in the entire Nazi camp system. Auschwitz II, known as Birkenau, was the component that transformed the complex into an extermination facility. Construction began in October 1941, 2 kilometers from the original camp, on the site of the demolished village of Brzezinka. Birkenau was designed for mass incarceration and mass killing simultaneously, on a scale that dwarfed anything else in the system. By 1944, the Birkenau complex contained more than 300 prisoner barracks. It held, at peak capacity, approximately 90,000 prisoners at any one time. It also contained 4 large crematorium gas chamber complexes, crematoria 2, 3, 4, and 5, each combining undressing rooms, gas chambers using Zyklon B rather than carbon monoxide, and industrial furnaces for body disposal. These facilities were not improvised. They were designed by the German engineering firm Topf und Söhne, whose engineers received patents for components of the cremation systems. The paperwork survives. Zyklon B, the trade name for hydrogen cyanide pellets originally developed as a commercial pesticide, was first used experimentally at Auschwitz in September 1941 on Soviet prisoners of war and Polish prisoners. SS personnel noted its effectiveness and efficiency compared to carbon monoxide. The decision to adopt it as the primary killing agent for Birkenau followed from that assessment. The selection process at Auschwitz-Birkenau is one of the defining images of the Holocaust, and it is important to understand it precisely. Deportees arrived by rail on a dedicated spur line that ran directly into the Birkenau compound, completed in May 1944. On the ramp, SS officers, frequently including camp physicians, divided arrivals into 2 groups. Those deemed fit for labor, typically men between the ages of 15 and 45, and women between 15 and 40, were registered, tattooed, and assigned to barracks. The remainder, which, depending on transport composition, could represent 70 to 80% of arrivals, were directed immediately to the gas chambers without registration. This is why the death toll at Auschwitz-Birkenau is difficult to calculate with absolute precision. Those who were registered left records. Those who were not registered, who went directly from the train to the gas chambers, appear in no prisoner documentation. Their numbers are estimated from the volume of transports, the capacity of the crematoria, and the testimony of surviving personnel and prisoners. The most widely accepted scholarly estimate, adopted by Yad Vashem and confirmed by the Höss trial records and post-war investigations, is that approximately 1.1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Approximately 1 million of them were Jewish. The Hungarian deportations of May to July 1944 represent the single most concentrated killing period in the camp's history. Following the German occupation of Hungary in March 1944, SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann coordinated the deportation of approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz in less than 2 months. During the peak period, the crematoria at Birkenau were operating beyond their designed capacity, according to testimony from Höss himself, given at Nuremberg. The bodies of those who could not be processed through the crematoria were burned in open pits. Rudolf Höss was captured by British forces in 1946, tried before a Polish court, and hanged at Auschwitz in April 1947, on a gallows erected beside the crematorium he had commanded. Before his execution, he produced a detailed memoir that remains one of the primary administrative accounts of the camp's operation. He did not, in that memoir, express remorse in any conventional sense. He expressed concern that he had not been efficient enough. Among the prisoner testimonies that have shaped our understanding of Birkenau is that of Primo Levi, the Italian Jewish chemist and writer who survived Auschwitz and spent the rest of his life trying to articulate what it had been and what it meant. In his book, If This Is a Man, he described what he called the gray zone, the moral ambiguity forced upon prisoners who were made complicit in small and large ways in the machinery of their own destruction. Levi's phrase has entered the historical and philosophical lexicon because it names something true about the system's design. Auschwitz was not only a killing facility, it was a machine for the dehumanization of its victims, a process conducted before and alongside the physical killing, with an institutional logic of its own. The camp was liberated by Soviet forces on January 27, 1945. They found approximately 7,000 surviving prisoners, those too weak to be evacuated on the death marches that had preceded the Soviet advance. They found warehouses containing hundreds of thousands of items of clothing, 7 tons of human hair, and the physical infrastructure of industrial murder in its largest realized form. January 27th is now observed internationally as Holocaust Remembrance Day. The date was chosen because of what was found that morning and because of what it represented about what human beings, organized into systems, are capable of building. We began with a number, 6 million, and noted that it can obscure as much as it reveals. We end with 5 places, 5 systems, 5 chains of command, and an accumulated death toll of somewhere between 1.7 and 2.5 million human beings murdered in facilities purpose-built for that outcome. Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Each was different in its methods, its scale, its longevity. Chelmno used vans, the others used chambers. Belzec closed after 10 months, having nearly completed its mission. Auschwitz operated for nearly 5 years. Sobibor was erased by its own operators. Auschwitz was preserved, and today receives more than 1 million visitors per year. But they shared a structural DNA. They were all administered by the SS. They all relied on the deception of arrivals. They all employed prisoner labor to manage the operational details closest to the killing. A design choice that distributed complicity downward while concentrating authority upward. They all conducted systematic evidence destruction as a planned final phase of operations. And they all operated, for most of their existence, in a context of international silence. This last fact matters. By 1942, information about the extermination camps was reaching Allied governments through multiple channels. Polish resistance reports, escaped prisoner testimony, Vatican intermediaries, and signals intelligence. The decision made by Allied leadership, primarily British and American, was not to make the destruction of the camps a military priority, and in most cases, not to make the public aware of what was occurring. The historiography of Allied knowledge and response remains contested and uncomfortable. It is not the subject of this documentary, but it is part of the full account. The perpetrators, too, require continued examination, not as monsters, but as a system. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted 24 senior Nazi leaders. The subsequent Nuremberg proceedings addressed specific professional categories: doctors, judges, industrialists, military commanders. They established in international law the principle that following orders does not constitute a defense against crimes against humanity. They created the framework of international criminal law that still governs war crimes tribunals today. But the vast majority of those who participated in the extermination program, the railway administrators, the camp guards, the civilian contractors, the regional officials who organized deportations, were never prosecuted. Most lived out ordinary lives in post-war Germany and Austria, in some cases holding the same professional positions they had occupied under the Nazi regime. This is not an indictment of post-war justice systems in isolation. It is an observation about the mathematics of complicity. The system was too large. Too many people had participated in too many of its components for any justice apparatus to fully address. What remains in the absence of full accountability is the record, the testimony of survivors, the documentation that the perpetrators failed to destroy, the archaeological evidence recovered from the demolished sites, the scholarship of generations of historians who have dedicated their lives to reconstructing what happened and how. Elie Wiesel, himself a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau, wrote that to forget the dead is to kill them a second time. That formulation is often cited, and it remains true, but it places the burden on memory alone. Memory is necessary, but insufficient. Memory must be accompanied by understanding. Understanding of the structures that made these places possible, of the institutional choices at each point in the chain where different choices were available, of the social and political conditions that turned a modern industrialized state toward systematic annihilation. Because the specific ideology is gone, the specific regime is gone, the specific geography of occupation is gone. But the mechanisms, the bureaucratic diffusion of responsibility, the normalization of dehumanization, the step-by-step conversion of legal discrimination into physical elimination, those mechanisms are not historical artifacts. They are human capacities. They have appeared before and since. Sobibor stood in a forest. Belzec stood near a railway line. Treblinka stood at the edge of what had been a village. Auschwitz-Birkenau stood on land from which a community had been erased to make room for it. They were built by people, staffed by people, administered by people, and they were stopped, eventually, incompletely too late, by people. That is the history, and it is ours to carry. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time. Keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.